Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, everybody. On behalf of the county, Canaan and Associates, and DPZ Co-Design, welcome to the fourth meeting of Series 2 of 3. My name is Marina Corey. I'm with DPZ, and I'm joined by Matt Lambert and Mike Wyke. And from Canaan, we have Eliza Giuliano with us, as well as many more from the county, including Alberto, Greg, Marcos, and others. All of these folks will be helping to answer the questions during the two Q&A pauses that we have during this presentation. As a reminder, Series 1 was an introduction to the comprehensive plan and the particularities of each of the 6 market areas. It provided detailed reference about each area of the county to assist us all in better celebrating the general character and individuality of each area. It also touched on strategies for growth based on what areas of the market area will generally be maintained, what areas will evolve, what areas will transform, or what areas will grow. As a follow-up, this series is a follow-up to an introduction to the sectors and the place types, 2 technical terms you're going to learn about today that are intended to further guide growth in a more predictable manner and in a way that supports the mayor's initiatives and what we are hearing many county residents want and support. And the rest of these Series 2 meetings will take place on Wednesday and Thursday. Series 3 will be about the zoning code and the zoning regulations intended to support the policies that will help guide growth, development, and conservation. And we hope to kick those off within a month. So we look forward to your active participation, collaboration, and engagement with this team as we collectively map and describe the way in which the county should grow over the next few decades and what it can look like. A few housekeeping rules before we begin the presentation. This meeting is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the Vision 2050 website. It's also being live streamed to the Orange County social media. We will ask you to write or type your questions through the Q&A button for those of you attending through Zoom, as well as on the county Facebook page, which we're monitoring, and we'll be able to answer that way. And at the end of this, we're asking those attendees on Zoom stay on to take a short survey that we will then take the feedback that's provided to us and incorporate that into future presentations. So we find that those of you who are taking it, it's incredibly helpful. So thank you. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Alberto Vargas, the planning director, who will take it over from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. And thank you everyone for your time this evening. And I'm excited to be part of this town hall meeting, the second series of the town hall meetings in which we are participating and engaging in a discussion to plan for the next 3 decades. As you probably heard, if you participated in the first town hall meeting series back in December, we're attempting, this overall perspective is attempting to plan a little bit different than we have been planning for the last 30 years in the county. It's a slightly different approach. It's taking the county's context and its diversity as a core planning principle. We're moving away from an approach of a one-size-fits-all. It's really context sensitive about the diversity of the county in every aspect. We started with the macro approach of market areas because that gave us a larger perspective, not only in the way that we're engaging the residents to participate, but also to provide a very strategic way to order the comprehensive plan as we continue with the refinement of the document itself. As Marina mentioned, tonight's effort is about the sectors themselves, which is a current planning strategy that begins to formulate the vision of the county. It delineates the areas in which we are setting the policy for those areas that will develop, redevelop, and pretty much stay the same in very specific areas of the county that this town hall meeting will describe. And then on top of that layer of the visioning mapping, we have the place types, which is a new nomenclature for our new future land use designations, and we'll go over that as well. What you have displayed on the screen today is just a dashboard of the different meetings that have taken place for this second town hall meetings. We started last Monday with the South Market area, followed by the Northwest Market area and the core market area. Here we are today, March 29th, speaking about the general area of the East Market area of the county. We will follow next Wednesday, March 31st, with the rural East Market area, and we will end on Thursday, April 1st, with the Southwest Market area. So with that, I am going to turn this over to District 4 Commissioner Maribel Cordero, who's with us tonight, to perhaps give us some welcoming remarks. Commissioner, welcome, and thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you, Alberto, and thank you to all the staff that have been here day after day doing this presentation of, to benefit and the best interest of our community. And I have to say thank you to all those constituents that are there, listening to this. And, like Alberto said, if you have any question, they will be available. Our office will be available as well. And any question, question or any concern or anything, you can direct it to Alberto or to all the people, the staff, Orange County staff that is here. And thank you again, and have a good evening. And I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And we'll follow with District 5 Commissioner Emily Bonilla. Good evening, Commissioner, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Hi, good evening. I am so happy to be here. This is something that I have been really looking forward to. And I know I've said this in a couple of others. Those who are probably on this call who were involved with the GROW development know that this is something that came out of the controversy of that. Mayor Jacobs thought that we needed to move forward in a more productive way, and staff has been so great in putting this together and has been working for many years on this. So I'm pretty sure that they're happy to see this coming to the community meetings portion of this whole project. So we're getting there. Alberto, if you could tell us how much longer it will be, give us an estimate. But we're definitely looking forward to your feedback, because only with you can we make this happen and be something that's worthwhile doing. So thank you so much for being here, and please participate as much as possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Lambert with DPC. Thank you, Matt.
All right, thanks, Alberto. So in the last town hall series, which we didn't mention too much on, but I hope you've watched the videos. There were a lot of complex topics addressed to frame the importance of a comprehensive plan. Much of the public may not know what a comprehensive plan is. They don't interact with it regularly. So in this last meeting series, there were a lot of topics covered, such as how much will the county grow? What are the generational dynamics of growth and aging? What formats might growth occur in? What affects housing affordability, and whether people have transportation options? And what are some places, which places are more connected to regional transportation than others? What new mobility technologies are emerging, and what's the current state of planning? and how zoning works with the comprehensive plan, and so on. Quite a lot must be considered when developing a vision that looks forward for 30 years. So if you haven't watched the prior series 1 of these meetings that's available on the Vision 2050 website, please check that out. It gives a little more context to these meetings. Today we're much more focused. So back on the 30 years, it's really a long time. If you jump back 6 times at 30 years, we're in 1840. Sewing machines were the hot new thing that hit the street. And the last 30 years took us from early personal computers in the homes that could afford them to advanced computers that are now in our pockets, on our wrists, in our cars, and managing rovers on Mars. Where will we go in the next 30 years? Technology may be difficult, but we're working on a plan to move forward in a coordinated fashion. Comprehensive plans are designed to look towards a distant future and to align all the policies and activities of the county towards a shared future vision. Orange County, of course, is a hotbed of innovation and home to quite a diverse and growing population. As we'll look at growth management, we have to consider how to grow while protecting sensitive natural lands and the county's rural heritage, to grow in ways that increase equity and affordability, mobility options and access to jobs, and places, of course, for friends, family, and fun. As a reminder, the current comprehensive plan was adopted in 2009. There's a lot of content in there, and of course, Vision 2050 will have a lot of content as well. But we hope that this vision, focusing on the idea of a vision, can help make it more clear, more friendly, and available to the public to understand, really to assure that we set clear expectations and goals. Today, we're going to focus on growth and development policies and the way that Vision 2050 leads the county towards a future vision. A major component of growth, of course, is the projection of, well, how much growth will there be? What is the population? The county has been growing steadily. As you can see in this chart, it's almost linear. But at the end of it, just like that cone of uncertainty with hurricanes, the exact future is uncertain, but we have a good idea of the general path, which leads towards quite a significant amount of growth in the next 30 years. That chart landed about 690,000 people, right, more or less. Either way, it's a lot of new neighbors. And to put that in perspective, the city of Orlando has a population of 280,000 people. So the county overall will most likely grow by 2.5 times the population of the city of Orlando. But to think that growth would just occur everywhere evenly across the county would be bad planning. And if you'd allow that type of growth, that would be bad policy. It would result in degraded quality of life, increasing driving, increasing the cost of infrastructure and the tax burden that's associated with it, and reducing the rural and natural lands. So I think we can agree that that's really not a desirable outcome. So instead we plan in order to direct growth to specific places and not everywhere. One of the 2 components of growth management in Vision 2050 is sectors. Sectors direct growth to where it is encouraged. But we also plan in order to direct the character of new development in this forward-looking manner of planning, and the character of new development in those places where growth is desirable. When we consider the county as a whole, it's quite a diverse place and should continue to offer people a diversity of options of where to live, diverse job opportunities and educational choices, and diverse ways to get around. In Vision 2050, place types direct the character of future growth through form, intensity, block structure, civic spaces, the mix of uses, and mix of mobility options. So sectors, these are large. They cover a lot of ground. They're more general, and place types fall within them. Together, these 2 direct growth towards a future vision. They work together. Where growth occurs and the character it takes is a key component of Vision 2050. These live in the future land use component of the comprehensive plan. Sectors determine where growth should occur, and place types determine the form that growth will take. Now, while most residents don't interact directly with the comprehensive plan or future land use, we hope Vision 2050 as a document is one that everyone can understand, that you can contribute to the vision, and that it helps to build expectations for what the future may become. So there's a larger overall picture that sectors and place types fit into. These are terminology that you may hear in this presentation. You may have heard it before, and I hope that you can become familiar with these going forward. Some of the elements are policy and some are not. At the top, there's incorporated municipalities. These are, the cities like Orlando, for example, who determine their own growth policies and their own goals. There's the market areas, which Alberto spoke about, and that's how these meetings are being structured. These are really a tool that allows us to zoom in on parts of the county that have different characteristics, to analyze those places, to engage with people who live and work there, and to consider how policies should react differently to that context. There's then the urban service area, and it sort of overlaps a bit with the others. So they're not all mutually exclusive boundaries or concepts. But the urban service area is a policy boundary that determines where utility services will be offered. It's an indirect growth policy in that it limits where growth can occur from an urban versus rural standpoint. Then the following three elements are the subject of this and the following set of town hall meetings: sectors and place types in this meeting, Orange Code, the zoning code update in the following series of meetings. And these work together, the three of them, to control the intensity and form of growth. So today, again, sectors and place types, we'll just pound those words in, you'll hear it a lot, and then Orange Code next time, because it's so closely tied to place types. But first, we're going to jump into sectors. Remember, sectors determine where growth can occur. They also determine the amount of growth in each area through the place types that are, say, allowable or encouraged in the sectors. Technically, they're really ideally limiting the different types of place types, the new future land use categories. We'll look at those place types after sectors. But first, to understand sectors, it's best to think about them as determining where growth should be directed. Here are the 6 sectors in Vision 2050 on the left. And as a reminder on the mid-right over there, incorporated areas, which are not included in the sectors, because these municipalities manage their own growth. So when we look at the numbers, we'll pull out the incorporated areas. And later when we look at the specifics of sectors and place types, we'll also look at where those incorporated areas exist. So in terms of sectors, on the top left is the targeted sector. This includes the growth priority areas. Next is the intended sector, where existing area-wide plans have been developed and where existing plan developments have been approved and entitled. These 2 sectors are where nearly all the future growth is directed through sectors. Following are the established rural sectors, retaining their current character. These areas may see a small amount of natural growth, but in general, growth is discouraged in a large or disruptive manner. The preserve sector is for large and contiguous preserved natural areas. And then at the bottom is the special sector. And this is really for more complicated land uses, power plants, water treatment, airports, universities, and other places that have non-typical characteristics which require special attention. Across the whole county, this is the breakdown in land area of sectors. The vast majority of the county is within the preserved, rural, and established sectors, where significant growth is discouraged. Instead, growth is directed to the targeted and intended sectors, roughly 12% of the county. And in chart form, here it is. We've specified roads just so you understand that when you're calculating over such a large area, just the width of roads is a lot of ground when you add it all up. So we've lumped them into incorporated areas since we're talking about land use anyhow. The incorporated areas and road rights-of-way occupy quite a large amount of the county, but not nearly as much as the preserved and rural sectors together. Areas prioritized for development in the targeted and intended sectors remain a small percentage. So let's take a closer look at each sector. First, the areas where significant growth is discouraged, and then areas where growth is encouraged. We're going to look countywide first, and then we'll look at the market area specifically. So here's a map of the whole county. We'll see how sectors are mapped here, like I said, and then we'll look at the East Market area after that. Incorporated areas here in black cover about 24% of the county. We've only labeled a few here for orientation and legibility. As I mentioned, these areas manage their own growth policies, and the sectors apply to the unincorporated areas only. So of the no or low growth sectors, the preserve sector is the simplest of all. These are lands currently in preservation or with policies that direct for future preservation. The sector includes only large and contiguous areas in preservation. While many developments may have additional smaller conservation easements, those tend to exist in the established sector or the intended sector or elsewhere. Here's the preserve sector mapped. It's about 21% of the county overall. The rural sector includes lands in agricultural use, rural settlements, large undeveloped lands where growth is discouraged, and natural areas that are not yet in preservation. This is the rural sector mapped. Like the preserve sector, the rural sector covers about 21% of the county. Now the established sector, this includes most of the county's residential areas, the existing ones, with a goal to maintain the current character. Here's the established sector mapped. These are residential areas principally surrounding and in between incorporated areas. The established sector includes about 13% of the county overall. Adding the three together, you can clearly see the areas where growth is discouraged, comprising 55% of the county. Of course, we're excluding the incorporated areas here, and they set their own rules, so that's they sort of manage this differently. But in terms of this overall, it's 55% of the county where growth is discouraged. And so I'd like to look at it this way. If you have kids, I have a 6-year-old, you may be familiar with the healthy eating strategy being used today of Go Slow and Whoa, encouraging kids to eat lots of healthy foods, the Go, not to eat many processed foods, the Slow, and to very rarely eat sweets and treats, the Whoa. We can look at the sector map in the same light with the Whoa areas where we want to discourage growth, like the preserved and rural sectors, slow areas like the established sector, and next we'll look at the Go areas. So the intended sector is a Go area that includes places that are already, that is before Vision 2050, already planned for new growth, including entitled planned developments and area-wide plans. This sector represents about 5.5% of the county and includes areas like Horizon West, Innovation Way, and Lake Pickett. And lastly is the targeted sector, where most new growth will be directed and encouraged. This sector includes existing commercial, industrial, and higher density residential land located along the county's major roadway network and areas along its future planned transit routes. Here's the targeted sector map. This represents about 6% of the county overall. The targeted sector is heavily concentrated in the I-4 corridor and South Industrial area, but also in major roadways leading to the incorporated areas and in between them. Mapped along major roads, the targeted sector is closely tied to future transportation planning, coordinating land use and transportation. This land use and transportation planning ideal is fully embedded in Vision 2050, also in Orange Code, which are both exactly the type of planning documents that coordinate properly with the new FDOT context sensitive standards. We'll see in the East Market area, specifically the corridor focus in a few places, and also a slightly larger special area focus when we zoom in. Together, the intended and targeted sectors are where growth is encouraged, together about 11.5% of the county. And then there's that pesky special sector, small amount of the county overall, though a lot of the area of the East Market area. It includes places like UCF and the power plant, the golf center, other special places that are not what we'd call normative development. These places need special consideration and special rules. Altogether, we have a full sector map of the county. This map directs where growth should occur and how much should occur in any area. At this scale, it's hard to determine individual places, so we'll look at the East Market area specifically in just a sec. But first, just back to consider this Go and Slow Whoa approach. Sectors are pretty clear from this perspective, directing where and to what extent growth should occur. So let's zoom into the East Market area and see how sectors are mapped over here. First off, incorporated areas, very little of the East Market area falls within incorporated municipalities, just 2%. To the west is the core market area, which is mostly incorporated. And so that's that boundary that you share on the left. Here are the preserved areas. also comprising about 2% of the market area. Some of these may be small enough to handle at the place type level, and as these maps are in progress, this type of discussion is ongoing. Preserved areas are intended to cover large and contiguous natural areas. Some of these may be closer to smaller areas that are a little bit separate. Of course, we'll discuss that later, though. On the bottom right, in the rural East Market area, is a quite substantial, large and contiguous portion of the preserved sector, just on the border on the bottom right-hand side. So there are no rural areas in the East Market area, 0. Though the southeastern portion of the market area may appear to be preserved or rural, it's all mapped in the special sector, and we'll look at that separately. The established sector, this covers most of the East Market area outside of the special sector, 49% in total. There's little preserved and no rural sector in the East Market area. So together, these low and no growth sectors cover about 51% in total. Now, unlike other places, the East Market area is covered by a large amount of special sector, 22%. This includes the very large area of county services and facilities in the southeast, UCF to the north, and a few other special, smaller, specific uses. These are areas requiring special attention and consideration, so they don't really fit well into the go slow and whoa paradigm. They're kind of looked at on a case-by-case basis. And now for growth. So concerning the intended sector, where new growth is in process or has already been approved, this covers about 3% of the market area. Really, it's Avalon Park here. The rest of the market area has been pretty fully developed or falls within special areas. Most future growth is infill, but being next to the city of Orlando, infill along major roadways is really a huge opportunity. And now, Avalon Park's mostly built out, so maybe that should just be the established sector. We'll be looking at that in the mapping. So the infill areas, though, these are prioritized to the targeted sector, 12% of the market area overall. Here, the sector's intent is fairly legible to cover commercial corridors along major roads and large commercial developments at the intersection of multiple major roadways. It also covers a significant area around UCF, which is intended to intensify from a more automobile-oriented university-related departments and businesses and research there today into a mixed-use and active research center with supportive housing, employment areas, and other supported mixed uses. That strategy is heavily transit-oriented as well as the corridors, aiming to grow in places where it can absorb and support transit and also support surrounding neighborhoods, but to not encroach into the surrounding neighborhoods. The targeted sector builds on the transit corridor paradigm, along with intensifying activities at UCF to attract transit riders and reduce car commutes. We'll touch more on this in the place type discussion later, but let's look in total at the growth sectors. Intended and targeted is 15% of the market area. And of course, maybe Avalon Park should be existing, so it may be 12%. Anyhow, it's around 12 to 15% of the market area where growth is encouraged. So from a go slow whoa standpoint, here's how the sector map breaks down in the East Market area. There, of course, are missing numbers if you add them up. These are road rights of way and other small pieces here and there. But in all, this shows that most of the area is in the slow and the whoa sectors, or in the special sector. Quite a lot of that is in the established sector, and only about 12% is targeted for infill in the go category. Of course, with that 12 to 15 Avalon Park in or out. So again, from a sector standpoint, this is the composite sector map. Hopefully this provides a strong understanding of sectors. But just to quickly tee up why we're using these constructs. Currently, the future land use on the right is a reaction to existing uses, and it must be changed, say, if an office building were to be converted to housing, for instance. It's unstructured, meaning there are no rules, and as a result, it is unpredictable. Sectors, as we've investigated just now in place types, which comes next, both levels of planning provide structured rules aimed at a predictable outcome. These are planned at the scale of an area, not property by property. As a result, it's possible to determine if future changes to future land use make sense or if it doesn't make sense. So sectors at the top on the left influence place types, and those establish the first structure. And then place types direct zoning and built outcomes, which we'll clarify here shortly. But before we move on from here, we'd like to see if there are any questions from attendees or viewers so far, or if there are items that the county or the consultant team would like to add.
Thank you, Matt. This particular drawing, I think, is helpful in helping to explain to people why sectors are needed, because they are advisory only. And while they vary in size quite a bit, they are helping to inform where place types are located. And they are at a different scale of the future land use. So I think this diagram explains it quite nicely. So a couple of questions now. The intended sector is one in which there is, and maybe this one can be directed to Alberto more so than you, Matt, but the intended sector is one that has, maybe one could say, the most varied types of development, because it's where PDs have been permitted. Could you describe a little bit if the character of the intended sectors will differ in any significant way to the established sectors?
Yeah, so Marina, that's a good question. The intended sectors, we were trying to identify all of those very large, well-coordinated communities that have gone through a process of approval for many, many months, years into the making, in which they generated their own policies for development and an associated set of regulations or a code that governs or implements the policies that were established for their growth. So what those intended growth sectors are pretty much going to stay the same and consistent with those policies. The established growth sectors, however, as we continue to understand them graphically when we see the maps, represent neighborhoods and communities that are pretty much built out in certain occasions. Some of them have infill opportunities, but very rarely they will change the character or the level of density that those residential neighbors would have right now. With a small caveat, the actual opportunity that some of those established neighborhoods present is consistent to a very important initiative now that will be part of this Vision 2050, which is the Housing for All initiative, and perhaps looking at opportunities for missing middle, where you would have a very compatible product type at a residential land use, but well incorporated and nestled into the established neighborhoods with a very compatible results. So when it comes to the established sector, you will not see very much variation, if you would, of the existing character of that community or neighborhood.
Thank you. And since you were mentioning missing middle, I'll maybe direct the next question to you too, Alberto, which is, this is from the mayor's Facebook page. What about affordable housing? Is that included in the plan? Because there is a need for it in the community. So maybe you can speak to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Board of County Commissioners accepted a 10-year action plan, and that was put together by representatives of different sectors of the community, in which it identified a series of different recommendations and strategies with a very focused implementation for the next 10 years. Among many of the recommendations, there are some very specific regulatory recommendations where the actual barriers that we found today in our existing land development code are being looked at. We have started with some of the specific strategies to eliminate some of those barriers, but Orange Code, which implements Vision 2050, and that would be the core topic of the next series of town hall meetings, series number 3, we will identify how well a lot of these modified regulations are part of Orange Code in order to focus on targeting 30 to 35% of the housing stock that is projected for the next 30 years. So if we have, let's say, just a little bit over 86,000 units being planned or predicted to be part of Orange County in the next 10 years, 35% of that total number will be targeted for attainable or affordable housing. Attainable housing would be much more of that workforce housing product type that is much needed in the county. Again, very strategic and specific approach towards understanding where the targeted growth sector correlates with existing employment centers and corridors that connect those employment centers and they provide great opportunity for higher densities and intensities in the county. So generally, they translate themselves as part of this targeted sector.
Thank you.
And not only in employment, access to transportation, which
Correct.
is very, very key in that sector. And we'll talk a lot about how we look at the form that development takes, how place types and when we get into Orange Code, how we focus on form to establish compatibility so that there's predictability throughout the system, so you can expect what the future may look like on properties around you, rather than not knowing what they look like. And with that expectation, lower the burden of process that leads a lot to the lack of affordability.
Yeah, I think the discussion of predictability is an important one, and I see it recurring in some of the questions. So here's another one I will throw to you, Alberto, simply because it is a place-specific one. It says one of your maps places Wedgefield in rural, and at one time it said preserve, which is correct. We are concerned that Wedgefield is being allowed to grow in an uncontrollable manner. And I think that once Matt begins to zoom into his place types, that may help answer some of the questions, because it'll explain the level of predictable development that can occur within these different place types and probably adjacent to Wedgefield as well.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely correct. We have an example today in which we will be looking at very close proximity to Wedgefield. You will see that it is in the established sector, but pretty much with a place type of a rural settlement, which will be consistent with the policies that are today in the comprehensive plan. We decided to embrace and be consistent to today's policies regarding rural settlements in Orange County. All 22 of them will be preserved, not expanded, and no additional rural settlements will be created as part of Vision 2050. So I think we'll be able to understand a lot better about the boundaries of Wedgefield and its environs and potential adjacencies to address the vision tonight.
Good. Now there's another question I'm going to direct to you again, and it's interesting because I was struck by the map Matt showed, the previous slide, which really showed the special sectors, and there's a lot of them in this area, and they butt up against essentially the established sectors, and there's not a targeted sector as a boundary around any of them, for example. But the one question here is an interesting one. It says, why is there not a special targeted sector or a special district that includes all higher education institutions in a 5-mile radius, for example, of UCF? Why is it only that UCF is highlighted as targeted and not Valencia College East, Full Sail, Barry University, Seminole State East, Research Park, Lockheed Martin East, and so on and so forth? So maybe you can speak to that, and then Matt can speak to the scale of these as well, because the interesting thing about the special sectors is that they're not either established or targeted. There are certain parts of them that may be targeted for growth and other parts that may remain established. And the whole point of the special sectors is that they write their own rules within a framework of, whether it's a campus plan or whatever the case may be, but they don't fall under the other sectors for that reason.
And I think the key point that you're highlighting, Marina, in your introduction to our response here, the key factor is scale. When we speak to the sectors themselves, the special sectors may be identifying those larger campuses, but then it will be under the place types, which pretty much are going to be the future land use designations that we will be able to identify with a little bit higher level of detail these other campuses that may fall within the same general category of special sectors, whether it's Valencia or Martin Marietta and others.
And it's also, we'll see Full Sail later, but they fit into the paradigm of a different type of place type, where we get away from so much of a sort of single use focused future land use. So it's different in that it can become an urban center, as we'll see, which may include a wider range of uses, essentially as of right. So should they choose to add those, whereas UCS has a different structure. It's not really structured on blocks. It has a history of its campus plan and so forth. So it's some fit into place types and some are different due to their form. But I will though mention on Wedgefield, I think that'll be on Wednesday in the rural East, Alberto.
That's right.
You're right. You're absolutely correct.
So we've had this question in the past as well, and it's a good one. And even though it's not very relevant to this particular section, because such a little part of it includes the incorporated areas. But the question is, while the vision plan is limited to the unincorporated areas of the county, please explain what efforts are being made to coordinate with the incorporated areas. And I may tie that to the next question, Alberto, which has to do with connectivity and mass transit, because that definitely is something that gets coordinated across boundaries. The particular question is, can you be more specific about connectivity and mass transit? Because Waterford, for example, was supposed to have dedicated bus lanes, but that never happened. So what could be the potential impact on a place type, or if it's in a targeted sector and the future bus transit sort of never happens?
Yeah, so there continues to be very well-coordinated efforts between the planning efforts when it comes to municipalities within Orange County. One example would be the city of Orlando and Orange County in the district of International Drive, where we're looking at premium transit as a catalyst for that particular area, and not only as a circulator, but potential future connection in different phases over the years. Those transit lanes that would connect different technologies, not only this particular premium transit as BRT, but other technologies that may come along over the years with different planning efforts. So we have certain joint planning agreements as well with other municipalities in which we identify adjacencies and compatibility in terms of densities and intensities of development, so that there is not an abrupt change in the areas where different municipalities interact with unincorporated Orange County. And we continue to, as part of Vision 2050, we will continue to expand on that different levels of coordination. When it comes to transit, though, and transit lanes, just to focus on Vision 2050 here, we're beginning to look at the corridors from a slightly different lens when it comes to planning as well. We're looking at the corridors themselves, not only as roads that could be extracted out of this effort because they become specific street types, but also we would like to introduce them as specific place types in terms of the corridors and the different potential association of typologies, if you would, of those planning future land uses or place types categories. So when we look at the corridors themselves and the associated land uses, we're looking at the framing of that open space, how they become much more human scale in certain areas, as well as the different potential technologies that connect those land uses to other places of destination, and that outdoor room planning efforts that we have over the years just defaulted to others to plan for the county planning efforts. We would look at the technicality, which is extremely important, of transportation needs, interconnectivity, and as well as addressing the traffic problem that we have, so that we tend to think about only moving the automobile. But here we're looking at a complete cross-section, complete communities, and complete neighborhoods when it comes to corridors themselves as well. So, and again, it's really important for us to put in perspective the larger effort of Vision 2050 that takes into consideration all of this different layering of the planning process to not omit roads as a future land use area designation.
And luckily, the way that that Florida DOT now is setting up their context system is to look towards comprehensive plans for directing land use, for them to coordinate the context through which vehicular modes and pedestrian modes and bikes and other details of the roadway are coordinated in the future more by place, based on these types of plans, the place types and Orange Code, as we get specifically into that.
Well, and I think you both just answered quite well the next question, which I was going to direct your way, which is UCF and the higher ed areas rival the international drive tourism in terms of economic impact. Why is the mass transit, transportation connectivity, and placemaking so neglected in the East? And I think these different layers of planning and these different scales of planning are exactly intended to really look at these different layers and elements that you've both talked about, whether it's placemaking or transit or a mix of land uses. Yes, Matt, you can add.
I would add two things. One is we won't look overall at, like in the place type examples, we won't look as specifically at the UCF research area, but it'll be off to the side of one of the examples. But that is directly about growth and intensity and quality, and how that draws activity to the area in the East. But I did want to mention this whole chicken and egg thing with transit. We can go one direction, which I think most people think about, which is to plan the transit route, figure out how to fund it, and then change the land use to match the sort of transportation that's coming down the pipeline. The other way is to plan your land use to be transit supportive, and land uses that are transit supportive concentrate populations at nodes and connect areas between nodes, as we'll look at in the place types. And by being transit supportive specifically in the land use, that makes it much more viable as a transportation route in the future, even if there's not the sort of funding mechanism today, that starts the planning ahead to direct where those routes should be in the future.
Well, and in fact, I'm coming to you from a community that DPZ designed 30 years ago, but the community was designed to be transit ready. Transit was anticipated to come 30 years later. So it even goes beyond that. It goes into thinking through the layout of the blocks, thinking through the layout of the streets, thinking through where you're going to plant trees and where you're going to have utilities laid out so they don't run diagonally across sites, so that these blocks could naturally infill 30 years later when transit was going to come, which is what we're hopefully beginning to experience right around now. So that was a good point. So last question before we go to the introduction of the place types. In this planning effort, have you anticipated future annexations into the unincorporated areas of the county? That's probably for you, Alberto.
Yeah, so we have, again, through our joint planning agreements with the different municipalities, we have a criteria for annexing into those municipalities. obviously it doesn't play the reverse from Orange County's perspective, but we certainly have a general understanding of how to move forward with annexations for those individual municipalities in which there is a specific privately or private interest to annex parcel by parcel or different areas for different planning purposes that those municipalities may have. We continue to coordinate those. We anticipate a range of specific conditions, and hopefully part of this, again, effort, as you will see the next segment of our town hall meeting tonight, is that Vision 2050 is not planning in isolation. At least at this stage of the process, we're beginning to look at a cohesive planning structure when we look at the corridors, when we look at the specific centers that we'll talk about under the place type segment of tonight's presentation, in which in order to do it correctly, we take into consideration the entire focus area. And then we extract, if you would, the boundaries of the municipalities, so that in the future, again, in an effort to coordinate with them, we would have a much more cohesive planning process, and hopefully we would influence the other in terms of what would happen in the entire character of that area.
Thank you, Alberto. Thank you, Matt. And we'll now let Matt get into the place type discussions, a slightly deeper dive.
Sure. And, we covered the sectors and took a break because we wanted to understand, just get these two concepts out there as clear as possible. And so sectors first, because the sectors really direct which place types should be allowed in a given area. Some place types are of a greater intensity and density, and others are of a lesser intensity and density. The targeted sector, for instance, encourages infill growth that permits place types of a higher intensity than in the established sector, which aims to maintain character permitting place types of a lower intensity. But place types are not only about density and intensity. They determine how growth can occur through physical characteristics like heights, block structure, civic spaces, which are usable outdoor space, not just open space dribbled around sites, a mix of uses, and of course with density and intensity as future land use normally includes. Many place type details are regulated in the zoning code update. They're in the Orange Code, so it's really connected quite tightly. And we'll discuss that again in the next series. In the comprehensive plan, the place types are the future land use. And so they do regulate this density and mix of uses, also the allowable mix of zones from the zoning code update. And they describe the intended character of new development and that of existing places. And with the existing places, there is improvement to be made in the established sector, and the place types can help to determine what goals may occur in neighborhoods of a certain type in the established sector, because rather than say a county-wide goal for one thing, these constructs allow you to very narrowly focus goals and priorities to areas where they work best, because some goals and strategies work for one type of area and not another type of an area. So these help you to sort of categorize them. Some things work overall, some by market area, some by sector, and some by place type. So place types, they're organized into 4 categories. The urban types applicable within the urban service area, rural types, which are applicable outside of the urban service area. There are open space types. These cover natural areas and the county's larger parks. And another special place types, which are similar to the special sector. And these are areas that need special rules or considerations, as we've discussed. So we're going to do these not exactly in this order. The order here is sort of from, most of these intents in a way, but we're going to go look at the simplest things first, and then we'll end on the more complex one. So in open space place types, there are 2. There's parks and recreation and natural areas, simple. Both types can be located in all sectors. Here on this slide, you'll notice the dials on the right-hand side. These are just to help compare one place type category from another in terms of relative access to transportation, relative density, and relative landscape preservation. So in some places, you'll see the density is low on Parks and Rec and none in natural areas. And you'll see later when we get to the centers, the dials all the way up. That's not a number, it's just a relative comparison. So Parks and Recreation, as we said, covers larger county parks and recreation facilities. These may be added to any sector in the future, and they may exist there today. Natural areas are places set aside for conservation. Of course, there's a lot of these in the preservation sector, but they can also be found in other sectors. So open space is easy. Now we'll look at the rural place types. These are also pretty simple. Rural place types are divided into 3 categories in the rural sector. These are all low density or very low density in character, with landscape and regional character preservation as the goal. Rural villages and hamlets, these are walkable places within the rural landscape, surrounded by land in rural use or natural areas. These places are rare, but they provide necessary services and some increased transportation access within the rural landscape. Rural villages and hamlets offer a degree of walkability by clustering development together and preserving rural lands around them. Rural settlements, these are well known in the county. They're the very low density areas that have already been developed within the rural landscape. These are generally intended for preservation of the current character. And then rural lands, and those are the areas we think of when we consider the rural environment. They have little to no development and are principally in agricultural or pastoral use. And we'll also touch on the special place types. Just like the special sector, these don't really fit into the urban or rural categories. These places require special rules, special consideration. And here are 3 examples: industrial, institutional, and entertainment, while a few other types exist, like airports, utility facilities, and there are others. And then finally, the urban place types. These types are the more complex of place types. There's subcategories. So we're going to dive into the rest of these, and then we'll look at some examples to help you understand how they lay on the ground. So the urban place types are further divided into 3 categories: centers, corridors, and the neighborhood fabric. Each of those categories has 3 types within them, totaling 9. It may be a lot, but it's really not a lot of categories when you think about future land use. And this is really aimed to structure in a simple and organized manner to better communicate the vision and expectations of future outcomes. Centers here are the most intense. These are all mixed use types, and they're at the higher end of density relative to other place types. The corridors connect the centers. We'll look at that. These are also mixed use, but at a lower density and intensity than the centers. And then the neighborhood fabric surrounds centers and corridors, and that's generally residential in use along with supported services like schools. So here's a typical, like a prototypical diagram to illustrate how the structure works. Centers are typically located at the intersection of major roads. They're intended to be mixed use and vibrant future places for higher density and the convergence of mobility options, as well as being places for jobs and entertainment. Today, these are mostly shopping centers along major roads, but they will be encouraged to infill with housing and additional non-residential uses along with civic space together to become more vibrant places. The lowest intensity center is called a neighborhood center. These are small, non-residential and mixed-use areas right now that may span just a few blocks, or they're small mixed-use areas where neighborhood compatibility is important. Many neighborhood centers existing today are intended to be enhanced or encouraged. Some of those single-use ones may be supplemented with additional housing to become mixed-use, but growth in neighborhood centers is not as significant in intensification as other centers, which we'll see. Many of the goals here are compatibility and scale and activity with the surrounding fabric. And again, what becomes a neighborhood center, and we'll see this as an example, are smaller areas that can't really grow a structure of blocks and open spaces. but urban and regional centers can. And these are the most intense place types that you may associate with typical mixed use and places that are vibrant and active. Urban centers, which are the lower out of urban and regional centers. These have buildings that may be around 4 stories on a commercial and connected street grid, mixing non-residential and residential uses. They're places for entertainment, services, job centers, and places that a good percentage of the population would like to live, but do not currently exist in any quantity. So a lot of people want this type of environment, not everybody, but it just doesn't exist today. Regional centers are the other type, and these are more intense. These are akin to downtown. A regional center in the future is planned for iDrive to become a key destination for the region in addition to downtown Orlando. These centers concentrate density and intensity for vibrancy. They're also key nodes along the future transit network. The type of development that transit needs to be efficient is this sort of intense mixed use in a small area where you can be serviced by a single or maybe 2 transit stops. They're also ideal environments for multiple mobility solutions, especially micro-mobility. So the corridors, these connect the centers. They're generally along transportation routes. They provide housing and businesses with transit access. Corridors are mixed use, typically adding residential uses to already commercial areas, but their intensity and density is much lower than the centers. Generally, because they're adjacent to neighborhood fabric, corridors must deal with that transition in intensity towards the surrounding neighborhoods. Main Street corridors, these exist throughout the county. The lowest intensity of the collection of corridors. They're low in scale. They may be single use today, but may transition to low intensity mixed use in the future. The corridors provide important services to nearby residents, and many could benefit from streetscape improvements, as Alberto talked about, street trees, bike racks, other things like that, and a code that encourages them to flourish rather than a code that they're fighting against. Main Street corridors are areas where the treatment of the street itself requires particular attention. And as we mentioned in the comprehensive plan, there's a key component to indicate to the state DOT that this type of future land use is aimed at walkable and bikeable places. And that fits into the department's context-sensitive approach. And it's also been built in the Orange Code, which we'll talk about in the next series. Transit corridors are the next corridor type. These are located along existing and future transit routes, most of what we'll see on the maps. Because these have greater transit access, or could in the future, they are intended to be higher density and intensity, connecting people with high quality transit. You know, it's that whole chicken or egg thing. And whether it's the chicken or the egg, these are mixed use areas that will encourage transit ridership. But the extent here of a non-residential use is really going to vary based on the market demand. Right now, a lot of the places that they're mapped may just be commercial, and there's actually quite a demand for housing. And so you may see those change to just housing or some mixture of uses, and both would be allowed where we're controlling the form of the buildings and less so the particularities of the uses. The primary goal here of the transit corridors is to increase the population living along premium transit routes to increase ridership and reduce future traffic impacts associated with population growth. Centers, of course, play a key role in this. Then finally, there's the suburban corridor. These are located along major arterials that are likely to remain car dependent in the future. Suburban corridors may be intensified with some mixed uses. They may be beautified, but their relationship with the major roadways requires special consideration with respect to zoning and land use. For instance, without on-street parking, it's not really reasonable to require buildings to be located close to streets, but conditions such as this image may be a viable solution. The remaining urban place types are neighborhood fabric. This makes up nearly all of the established sector and much of the targeted sector. Neighborhood fabric is principally residential, along with a few supportive services. The lowest intensity of these is the suburban neighborhood fabric. Located in the established sector, this covers nearly all of that sector. It's a familiar type, and here the goal is to retain the existing character. The suburban neighborhood fabric is currently entirely single-family residential, plus schools and religious facilities, clubhouses, and other uses that are common. Next is the suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. This is also in the established sector, sometimes in targeted. These are areas where single-family townhomes and multifamily housing are already mixed together. Like the prior type, these are targeted for preservation of character in general. When mapped in the targeted sector, though, it's intended to diversify the area with additional missing middle housing types, as has been discussed previously concerning naturally affordable housing. Suburban mixed neighborhood fabric is found where these types mix together in close proximity today, and in some areas as a buffer between the higher intensity fabrics and corridors, and higher intensity centers and corridors between that and the suburban neighborhood fabric. And the last of these types is the traditional neighborhood fabric. This is the highest intensity of neighborhood fabric. It's still not nearly as intense as a corridor or a center, though. These areas mix many housing types together into a tapestry of walkable blocks and civic spaces. Traditional neighborhood fabric includes schools and similar uses as does other fabric, along with very small corner shops and cafes. The principal goal of traditional neighborhood fabric is to provide a wide range of housing options in a walkable structure of blocks that's located near transit at centers and corridors. Here's how they all fit together into the sectors. Natural areas and parks on the bottom right, they can happen anywhere. But other place types are generally limited according to the sector, controlling the intensity of development as well as its character. The overall goal is to intensify the targeted sector, which is almost entirely through redeveloping commercial properties along major roads and retaining the existing character elsewhere, which doesn't mean no growth. Instead, it means a very limited amount of growth at a low volume or a slow pace. So those prior slides demonstrate the intent of place types as the future land use categories. And now we'll look at how they're applied to real places in a couple of examples. Now, the first one isn't in this market area, but it's a clear example to demonstrate the urban place type categories of center, corridor, and neighborhood fabric, very much like that diagram. We use the example in other market areas because it's clear. This is where East Semarin Boulevard connects with OBT. Some of this area is incorporated, but right now we're not going to look at that. We'll layer that over afterwards. Though I think it's helpful because we need to look at the incorporated areas to do the real planning first, and then sort of take them away for our policy. But that coordination with the municipalities would go forward on the basis of some of the corridor planning. So this area demonstrates some common characteristics that you see elsewhere. There's an automobile-oriented commercial corridors along Semarin and OBT, and larger shopping centers at the major intersections. Beyond the commercial properties, there's a wide range of housing, some large and small lot single family, some townhome, and some multifamily. So this is pretty common and exists in a lot of places. Here's what a sector map looks like for the area. It's pretty simple. Most of the properties are in the established sector, the tan color, with the targeted sector, the red along the major roadways, plus a small node of existing commercial to the north on Thompson Road. So here we keep the boundary of the targeted sector on the aerial. It's this thick black line. We made it red in the next example, so it's a little easier. But the targeted sector here follows mostly the commercial properties along major roadways, Semarin and OBT. And then single family neighborhoods beyond are in the established sector. But even from an aerial, you can sort of see where these sectors naturally occur. Here's a map of place types for the area, and we'll get into the specific types. But first, notice the outline of the targeted sector. Inside of this are the higher growth types, the centers, the corridors, and that traditional neighborhood fabric, which is a higher intensity of them. And then in the established sector are the low growth types, suburban neighborhood fabric and suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. So here are the centers. Two of these could be categorized as urban centers because they're large enough to develop a structure of blocks and civic spaces, and they can accommodate both mixed use and higher intensity residential infill. These are in the targeted sector, of course. The neighborhood center at Vota and North Thompson, on the other hand, is much smaller, and it can't really accommodate all that much growth, so it's a neighborhood center. And especially due to the compatibility needs with surrounding neighborhood fabric. here are the corridors. They're commercial and multifamily properties that are located along major roadways, but they're not included in the centers. In this case, both San Marino and OBT are planned for future transit improvements, so they're considered transit corridors, which is most of what we'll see. Transit corridors encourage more residential and mixed-use infill than, say, the suburban or the Main Street corridors. So the remainder of the area is all neighborhood fabric. That's the majority of the properties. Neighborhood fabric here is divided into suburban in light yellow, suburban mixed in light orange, and traditional in the darker orange. These are differentiated by density, where the suburban neighborhood fabric is the lowest density and traditional fabric is the higher of them. But all, of course, as I've mentioned, are lower than the corridors and centers. When we look back at the place type map, this area clearly demonstrates the centers corridors framework that we discussed. The framework is also important as we look to encourage more efficient transit functionality, increase ridership, where transit functions the best when there's nodes of mixed use activity, the centers, that are connected in lines, which also lend energy and ridership along the corridors. Now, here's what it looks like when we remove the incorporated areas. Much more difficult to discern what's going on. Of course, those are managed outside of the county, but this gives us an idea of how to coordinate policy. And so that will be going forward in Vision 2050, along with this sort of sector and place type planning paradigm. But you do have to do the planning by looking outside of the borders, even though the policy may not apply to them. So these maps are sort of in draft process. They're going to be shared on the Vision 2050 website in the coming months. But there's also a number of areas that will be the subject of further focused engagement to determine the most appropriate locations for sectors and place types. So that'll come later. But right now, let's look at examples in the market area. So here is one example, as we were mentioning before about Full Sail. So this East Market example builds from that prior one. It's just a little bit more complicated, but the structure is similar. Here's 436 at Aloma Ave and University Boulevard, the northwest edge of the market area. This area includes a mixture of housing of various types and densities, industrial areas, large and small, commercial shopping centers, commercial retail strips, as well as office and education uses. As I said, this is around Full Sail, where the University Boulevard meets 436. So here's how the sector map reads for the area. The industrial area is in the special sector at the center of the image. Surrounding this is the targeted sector along 435, Aloma, University Boulevard, and Palmetto Ave. Within the established sector that surrounds it. You may notice on Aloma and Palmetto that the established sector, it abuts the roadways in some places, interrupting the targeted sector. That's due to excluding existing single-family residential areas from the targeted sector. So it's like a mapping process thing. Here's the outline of the targeted sector laid over the aerial image. That big hole in the middle is the special sector, the industrial area. So we just wanted to point that out. But you can clearly see the difference between the lower density residential areas that are outside in the established sector and the commercial higher intensity residential areas and educational uses within the targeted sector. Here's a map of the place types. Again, pointing out that line of the targeted sector. Within the targeted sector are the higher growth types, centers, corridors, and traditional neighborhood fabric. In the established sector are the low growth types, suburban and suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. And you may also notice that transit corridors, and we'll look at those specifically, but they extend into the established sector because transit as a priority takes precedent over the sort of sector layout in terms of taking advantage of transportation routes, a core priority of Vision 2050. And we'll note on the centers, actually we'll look at them now. Here's the centers. There's 4 different sizes, and the neighborhood center to the bottom right, that might be an urban center, it might be a neighborhood center. We're sort of tweaking those distinctions. But in this case, 3 are categorized as neighborhood centers because their scale is relatively small and it's harder to develop a significant structure of blocks and civic spaces. However, at Full Sail at University and 436, that's quite a large area and could become an urban center over time. There's a lot of space available for infill and intensification. It could become a more significant hub of activity along with the university, which has a lot of jobs and active uses during the day. Quite a lot of housing could be added there, entertainment, and the area could develop into a structure of open spaces and blocks with a great mix of uses to support the university and support the area in general. And so that has a lot more opportunity for change than, say, the 3 other centers in the image. Now, along the major roads between the centers are the corridors. We've left these little bubbles to remind you of where the centers are because there's sort of gaps, but the corridors connect those. These are all transit corridor due to the alignment of planned future transit routes. And again, these extend beyond the targeted sector in some instances. So like the prior example that we looked at, they connect centers to each other and to other centers that are outside of the area pictured. Here are the special place types, industrial in the middle. If Full Sail could have been educational if it wasn't an ideal site for an urban center. And some of these educational uses, we're looking at the institutional use by, that's up by Aloma that might be part of the neighborhood fabric. So we're aligning some of these pieces. But hopefully the intent here is clear. And then there's the big Parks and Recreation corridor, sort of running through so you can identify these greenways. The remaining area is neighborhood fabric. The deeper orange is traditional fabric, and that's within the targeted sector. The fabric within the targeted sector here, all of it's traditional or higher intensity than the others. The remaining area is mostly suburban fabric with some suburban mixed fabric where there's already a mix of different types of housing, not just single family detached. So you can see that. So here's a composite when you put them back together. And, we take out the incorporated areas, but there's just a little bit at the western edge. For the most part, this is almost all unincorporated Orange County. So the sectors and place types here would be directly applicable. So here's one example. We have a couple different centers that are connected by corridors, and there's sort of neighborhoods at the edge and this industrial area in the middle. So let's look at another example. Colonial and Alafaya. It's just south of. We'll catch some of the UCF future urban center here, but this one's a little bit simpler than the last example. This area includes much more non-residential and higher intensity residential than most other places that we've looked at in other market areas. There's single family residential areas throughout and towards the western edge of the study area principally. Colonial and Alafaya have a mixture of medium-sized commercial development, strip commercial, housing, office, various things. So here's how the sector map reads for the area, very, very simple. The right side of the map is all targeted. This is the southern end of the UCF Research Center, and the targeted sector extends along Colonial Drive where future transit's planned. Outside of these areas is the established sector. And here's the outline of the targeted sector laid over the aerial image. Here, the difference in existing land uses within the targeted sector and outside of it are pretty clear. You can see the intensity of stuff today in the targeted sector and how that compares to the area outside of it. But again, the targeted sector here is covering the more intense land uses, but a lot of these are not very efficient land uses, and they could in the future be ideal places for redevelopment should that be chosen. So here's a map of the place types for the area overall. We'll jump in a second, but just to point out the outline of the targeted sector, which determines the place types that should be mapped within it. Those, of course, the higher growth types, like we said, centers, corridors, and traditional neighborhood fabric. In the established sector, the low growth types, suburban and suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. And you may also notice that the transit corridors do exist outside of the targeted center as the prior example, here along Rouse. These are the centers. Two are neighborhood centers. The bottom right one could be an urban center potentially. At the intersection of these major roads. Now, the urban center here, it's not at the intersection of major roads on this part of the map. Of course, it connects down, but it reflects the long-term vision for the UCF Research Park becoming an urban center, becoming the center of activity for this area. Now, the other commercial areas on Colonial, that aren't within the centers, they're really not proximate to the major roadway intersection. These are in the corridors, which we'll look at, which are here. These are the corridors mapped along the major roads connecting between the centers. These are all, again, transit corridors due to the alignment of planned future transit options, extending beyond the targeted sector. But note here that along Colonial, you may be able to see the transit corridor doesn't always extend the full depth of the parcels. The corridor here, it's along the roadway, and it's between about 200 and 500 feet, give or take, to not have a super jagged edge. But the goal is to concentrate the corridor, and we'll see later about how these parcels are managed with the other land uses. Now, the remainder of those parcels is going to fall into the traditional neighborhood fabric. But here the goal is to, again, intensify along the corridor and then step down in intensity away to be more compatible with the residential areas around. Here's the special place types. And this gives us an example of the educational type that makes sense to stand alone versus being part of, say, suburban neighborhood fabric. And, it's the high school, and high schools, they occupy a huge amount of land. They're not really so much part of neighborhoods, rather they're adjacent to neighborhoods. But elementary schools, those are often parts of neighborhoods. So there's some of that parsing that we're doing here in the place types that we'll have clear as the maps are released in a couple months. Now, the remainder of the map is neighborhood fabric. The deep orange is traditional neighborhood fabric in the targeted sector, and that's the higher intensity. So a whole bunch of that of the land on Alafaya, near UCF, it's already higher intensity, so it's mapped with this traditional neighborhood fabric that allows it to, in some cases, further intensify in areas that aren't developed to infill with additional housing. Now, all the neighborhood fabric that's within the targeted sector is traditional, including that area we just talked about. The remaining is suburban and suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. Those are in the established sector. So here's the composite map again, calling out the different place types. In this case, the entire area is in unincorporated Orange County, so the sectors and place types are applicable. So hopefully this helps to understand the different types and how they can be applied to direct the character and intensity of future growth. So the centers, and we've started to intensify the colors and differentiate them. We'll work on those a little bit more so that you can clearly see where growth is intended. So, the urban centers the most, and then neighborhood centers, and then corridors, and then traditional fabric, and so on down from there. So as I pointed out, these will continue to be refined as maps, and they'll be published for public review in the next few months. Those are the main topics. We've covered a lot in growth management policy so far today, but our goal is to share information about comprehensive plan, about the concepts of sectors and place types, so that you're all able to interpret the maps as they're released for review, and so that ultimately you can better interact with the comprehensive plan. Of course, a survey will be shared soon to capture specific feedback on the Vision 2050 website. And in the next set of town halls, we'll get into the code, the Orange Code, and its connection with the comprehensive plan policies. We'll cover questions and qualifications here in a second with Marina, but I wanted to leave this last graphic up for that. And this is what correlates the different place types with the sectors. And now that we've seen them, you may be able to better understand them. As we've seen, on occasion, a place type may be applied outside of the sector that it's intended for. sectors are advisory, place types are regulatory. So but when that happens, those situations should really clearly identify the need for close evaluation. Like, why is this place type here? By being structured and predictable, having that bit of misalignment, which is allowable, should at least, bring some focused attention. So now I'm going to hand it off to Marina for some additional questions and discussion.
Thanks, Matt. In looking at the allocation of place types, this is not a question that someone asked, but I'm going to ask it because I know it always comes up in these kinds of meetings, and maybe you can elaborate a little further. The suburban and the suburban mixed fabrics are really intended for the established sector, and we are assigning the traditional fabric for the targeted sector. Someone may ask, why can't we have more suburban in the targeted sector or suburban mixed use? So can you talk a little bit about why not?
Oh, sure. Well, there's lots of suburban neighborhood fabric today, and if we really need to absorb a good amount of future growth, if we want to provide for more attainable and affordable housing, and if we want to be efficient with our roadway infrastructure, which has a major impact on future taxes as well, that you want to grow in an efficient manner, which means a higher density than suburban neighborhood fabric, but not at a higher density just for the sake of a higher density. And this is where we'll get into the Orange Code eventually, which is as those sites in the traditional fabric may redevelop, that the goals are to add streets so that walkability is an option, so that biking is an option, and to coordinate building compatibility in terms of form. But it's really that the intended sector are places that we want to see growth occur, and we don't want to waste land by growing at a low intensity. And in addition, we've seen that there's a significant demand for those housing types. They just haven't been allowed historically in many places. It's been an uphill battle, and as we see that sort of tip over, there's a lot of opportunity to infill with housing types that are in demand by a bunch of different market segments. They just don't exist today in the market. So because growth is intended there, we don't want to be inefficient with the growth. We want to be efficient with the growth. And that helps preserve, that helps preserve rural areas, and it helps preserve natural areas.
That's right. And when you say that they're not that they weren't permitted, you're really talking about zoning has not enabled this missing middle housing that is now being permitted, permitted through the Orange Code, which is really providing the mechanism by which people can put developers can put in, not only mix the building types within these areas in a context appropriate manner, as Alberto described earlier, but also enables more easily the townhouses, the duplexes, the triplexes, and the fourplexes, or the small walk-up apartment buildings. Not only the very large multifamily building, there's a place for those as well, and not only single family, but that range in between.
And Marina, I think generally the question hopefully has been addressed, but something that could be added as well is that when we begin to put in perspective what has been presented today regarding the targeted sector, at the scale of this particular market area that we're discussing today, the East Market area, we identify 12% of the entire targeted sector is or the entire market area is a targeted sector today here as per our discussion. And when we look at the county-wide percentage of the targeted sector, is about 6% of the county, or just north and south of 50,000 acres. Our preliminary analysis identifies that within that general acreage, about half of it is either undeveloped or underdeveloped, meaning that there is quite a bit of infill opportunity for a very well smart growth approach towards densities and intensities to take place within the targeted sector. Everything included that you just mentioned: transit, ready development scenarios, as well as the great incorporation of open space at a different scale than we've been planning in the past. So this new communities in the targeted sector, if we're talking about that percentage of the county, should be planned for a completely different type of neighborhood that would take place in the established sector, for example, as Matt alluded to, and rightfully so. There's quite a bit of opportunities out there to continue to plan and infill suburban mix and suburban place types within areas outside the targeted sector. So we want to concentrate higher densities and intensities where it makes sense to continue to address the prioritized needs of initiatives that are addressing affordable housing, housing for all solutions, and the sustainability plan as well. So hopefully that has answered the question.
Yes, and it's not to say that the traditional fabric doesn't incorporate single-family housing. It absolutely does, but it's integrated with the higher and the medium intensity as well. So segueing right into, I'm surprised this question hasn't been asked before, but if a developer wants to build a new single-family residential subdivision that is car-oriented and filled with cul-de-sacs, how feasible would that be per the policies of this plan?
Well, certainly not in the targeted sector. and also, well, and also there's, you know, there's a larger impact of that. You know, one of the things that we'll look at in Orange Code are how new development is set up to be structured into defined blocks and a connected transportation network. Now that's very different than, say, older subdivision patterns that have been in place from the 50s through the early 90s, and that changeover, you've actually been seeing that in a lot of the new growth in recent years within the intended sector, where new housing is built onto a structure of connected blocks with open spaces that can be walkable, that can be bikeable. And when you build in just that format of just single family on disconnected streets, you can only drive, and if you can only drive, then that is going to increase traffic. So there's a lot of that out there already. But if we're going to absorb or hope to absorb 690,000 people, we need to really be avoiding future catastrophes of transportation, and find ways to absorb that in a walkable environment that's connected to transit. And so it's just not compatible with the targeted sector. But in terms of supply and demand, there's a whole lot of supply of that today, and those areas will be improved in terms of sidewalks and access to trails and so forth. But in terms of new areas, it's not an efficient way to grow.
Yeah, and just to expand on that, Matt, I think you generally framed the question very well as it relates to the targeted sector. I do want to emphasize, though, the fact that we are seriously considering the diversity of the county in terms of preferences. As part of the introduction of the town hall meeting today, it identifies that there is a place with different character for different residents that have different preferences in the county. So for those that are looking for a place that is suburban in nature, that has that type of character, there's quite a bit of supply existing conditions. But if there is a development that happens to be compatible and adjacent in the right sector where this particular place type that we're discussing can take place, that's why this 3 scales of planning approach of Vision 2050 can present that level of opportunity and still have quite a bit of predictability as to where those places could happen. But along the lines of your response as well, is that even though this particular new neighborhood may have cul-de-sacs and may be very automotive oriented because of its overall layout, we would always, I think, as part of the review approval process, encourage the element of walkability certain elements of interconnectivity where if there is a possibility to connect one cul-de-sac to the other, and it may not be by automobile, there's always a pedestrian connection so that the neighborhoods can have that level of livability associated to them. So, and even the overall character of those cul-de-sacs, if we can begin to move away from the prototypical solution of an engineered cul-de-sac and introduce an element of amenity to those neighborhoods, such as a green space or a close, as we call them, you know, there's always going to be an engaged dialogue to those subdivisions that may be much more suburban than urban in nature at the planning review level.
And it's good to point out that there are still large properties that have not been developed within the established sector that are mapped with suburban neighborhoods. So yeah, there are a lot of opportunities for that, and that would be targeted for, you know, for established, but not for the targeted.
And I'm going to add two things to that, which is that the people who live on cul-de-sacs, the cost of building out these cul-de-sacs are not borne by only those residents who live on those streets. By virtue of the fact that there are so few homes, that street is paid for by other residents who then see the traffic on their street augmented by virtue of the fact that there's less connectivity. And so it really doesn't benefit the community as a whole. There's a place for them, but they're limited. And that maybe bring me into the next question, which is, can you expand on the intended sector and where that would be again as PDs? And are there any existing PDs in the intended sector? I think the answer is the majority of the PDs are in the intended sector, at least the plan, but under various phases of that have already been approved and may have just started building or plan to shortly. Right, Alberto?
Yeah, and again, we are at the very beginning of this mapping exercise, as we are only in our fourth meeting of this series, where we're beginning to better understand the mapping effort of not only the sectors but the place types themselves. The intended sector would be able to embrace some of these communities, or the majority of the communities that have already entitlements associated to them. So you're correct, but there are some PDs that are zone PDs that may fall outside, and we will have to continue to better understand where they belong in this planning exercise.
Yeah, there's over 400 PDs. Eliza's reminding me in Orange County, so there's a lot of them. So here's a question. Are place types planned for areas near the landfill and OUC coal plant? What is the county's responsibility in planning and permitting development around those areas that are clearly not healthy for residential development? A resident apparently recently sued Avalon for air quality. Did not know that, but I'm presuming that the...
So OUC properties and the landfill would fall within the special sector. Avalon, on the other hand, is in the intended sector, and they have, the development itself has been approved and it has existing entitlements within that particular community. The draft sectors and place types that are part of Vision 2050 do not anticipate a continued development trend that is similar to those communities adjacent to these particular areas. So again, just to put in perspective, the beauty, I believe, of being able to have this scale of planning efforts is to be able to have that vision map, the sector map, that would allow us to look at development scenarios with a very predictable manner for the next 3 decades, to be able to understand where communities and what the scale and the character of those communities would be, and where it's not intended to be to develop, which gives us that dashboard that I spoke to at the beginning of the meeting today.
So I think that segues nicely into the next question, which is what percentage of the 690,000 people are planned to be absorbed in the east sector?
So,
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, if we look at the percentage of population today of the 1.4 million people, and we can extrapolate the growth within the East market area, we anticipate at 20% of the 2-point-some million people that is expected to grow, potentially that's about 400,000 people in the East market area within the next 30 years.
Yep. So this is another good question, which is, I live in an area that seems to be categorized as a targeted sector, but my property and my neighbors all have large lots in the range of 3/4 to 1.5 acres. So I'm not sure why it'd be done as targeted, but does this new category mean that new development immediately around us is going to be significantly different from our existing development? And I think Matt, Alberto can address maybe the specifics of where this area could be, and maybe the person who wrote that question can tell us the area they was thinking of quickly in the Q&A. But more importantly, the transitions that are created between these different types of place types, because we wouldn't naturally be zoning large areas as within a targeted area if they're not commercially zoned.
Yeah, sure. There are a number of examples where I said there's an exception, and it's worth looking at why. And so in the last round, the last meeting, we saw a specific set of larger lot single family that was in the targeted sector, but as a place type remained suburban neighborhood as a place type. So that means that those lots themselves were not intended for any change, but yes, the area around was intended for change if it were in commercial use. So that's really on the place type map to say, well, what do we expect to see around here? Now, if it's next to a corridor, along a corridor, that's where growth will be channeled towards the major roadway and stepping down away from it. If it's next to a center, now a center will be more intense. If it's next to a traditional neighborhood, it would be a mixture of different types of mostly residential uses. Now, Marina mentioned the transitions. There's some level of that in the comprehensive plan in terms of the description of these types and where the zones that are allowed within them should generally be located, like in a corridor that's the higher intensity zones that are allowed in the zoning code. Like most of these places allow 3 or 4 different zones within them. So the goal would be on that corridor that the higher intensity zones are closer to the major roadway and lower intensity away from them. Similarly with centers. Now, there's an additional set of standards that have been built into the Orange Code draft, which deal with transitions between zones at their boundaries, and the way of say taking if you have an existing, say, large lot single family, the abutting properties then may be required to match that zone, and then you can step up away from it, but it's in a series of transitions, so that you're not directly abutting much higher intensity with much lower intensity, but you're feathering that difference. So some of it happens by the place type, and some of it happens in the zoning code.
That's right. So Alberto, the person who asked this question specified the area, so I'd like you to address it. Specifically, it's the Forsyth Old Cheney area. But I also do want to say that residents are going to be provided an opportunity to really scrutinize these maps and make recommendations and suggestions as to how certain areas can be tweaked. Neighborhood associations are going to look at this, and residents are going to look at this, and there's going to be an opportunity to reshape some of these boundaries.
Yeah, that is correct, Marina, and we will continue to look at our best effort to address the mapping in a draft mode, and again, compatibility and adjacencies are taken into consideration when we identify the new future land use designations or the place types. So
I'm going to segue to transportation. One resident asked this question before, and it's been on the list. In terms of connectivity and mass transit, is Orange County planning corridors for self-driving cars? And I think Matt may want to tackle this one too, because the geometry of roads is one thing, but the land uses and the way the pattern of development happens is something entirely different.
Right. I would think Alberto might want to address the first question, then I can talk
First one.
about
Yeah.
the second portion.
Yeah, so because I could give it my best shot, but because we do have, as a panelist, Mr. Renzo Nastasi, the head of transportation planning of the county, I'd like for him to see if he can just touch base on the next, decades of planning, whether or not we are thinking about the technology of self-driving cars and automobiles as we plan for the future. If he's still with us.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, Renzo.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So Orange County has actually identified a number of quarters that can be ready for the autonomous vehicles, particularly the areas that we're looking at are in the UCF area. So there are a number of efforts that are being done in conjunction with the Florida Department of Transportation and UCF. So it entails the connection of, for example, the signal systems connecting to vehicles and pedestrians. So those are elements that are currently underway. And we've identified a series of additional quarters that will be ready for the type of technology and automated vehicles operating on certain quarters. So we are thinking about the future, and we are in fact implementing a series of new upgraded signal systems that are capable of connecting to vehicles and pedestrians. So on the pedestrian side, there are certain apps that are available on iPhones, for example, that will connect to vehicles and signal systems. And on the vehicle side, as I mentioned, it entails the connection of signal systems to the cars and also pedestrian identification systems. So all of these items are currently underway. Obviously, it'll be a number of years before we're fully automated, which would also entail new cars to be fully loaded with these systems. So it's coordinating with vehicle manufacturers, Florida Department of Transportation, and of course the county. So hopefully that sort of addresses the question.
And
Yeah,
of course, as we set out in the beginning, 30 years is a long time. So while we don't anticipate that would necessarily, have a big rollout in the next few years, the 30-year time horizon, it's definitely there on the table. The one thing from a land use perspective is that whether it's human drivers or computer drivers, that doesn't change the fact that that land use and transportation efficiency is important by having clear and meaningful destinations that are accessible by multiple modes of transportation, from people by walking, biking, scooters, you name it, these one-wheeled things. People need access in wheelchairs, as well as autonomous vehicles and transit vehicles and standard cars. And so as the sort of autonomous future comes into fruition, it doesn't change the need to have efficient land uses that work across multiple modes of mobility and not just oriented towards one.
Thank you, Matt. And I think the next question is, it's a long paragraph, and I'm going to read it because I think it's a very important discussion item, and it may end up being our very last question, but it's a good one to end on. So if you go, and I'm going to take a first stab at answering it too. If you go to these mixed-use walkable communities, such as Baldwin Park or Oviedo in the Park in Seminole County, that already exist, which are high density to accommodate the hordes moving here, people don't walk in them. Yes, they walk a path for exercise, but the people living in apartments on one side of the lake still hop to their car to go to the walkable distant restaurants because it's Florida. It's pouring rain, it's hot and humid, it isn't practical. So you can build high density and walkable all you want. It sounds utopic, but in the end, we just still end up with way too many cars on the surrounding roads, more so than with the suburban neighborhoods. I know it's going to happen due to population growth. We have no choice and must have affordable housing. Yet this idea that transit and walkable will take care of not increasing traffic is not realistic. I hope at the least that transit is built first instead of or after the fact. This may have been mentioned earlier. I had to step out, for which I apologize. So it's an important question and it's a valid question to ask, but I have to say, I have to disagree with the premise that people don't walk in them. And I live in one of these walkable mixed use communities. And you have to take a step back and say, the average American takes anywhere from 9 to 13 car trips a day. So we're not saying that every car trip is going to, every trip that an American person takes, or family takes, would be by car. If 1 or 2 or 3 of those trips can be by foot, that's already helping the equation, and it's helping people. And now we hear in Florida it's too hot. We hear in Winnipeg it's too cold. We hear in all these different places there's always excuses as to why people won't walk. But if the environment is created in such a way that it makes it, as Matt was describing, there's a comfort level. Yes, people will not necessarily walk at noon on August 10th to a restaurant, but in November, they may do it at noon. So the idea of these mixed-use walkable communities is if the infrastructure is there to enable walkability and bikeability, at certain times of the day, people will take those trips. Moreover, there have been studies now of these walkable communities, and the internal capture within them is anywhere from 10 to 30%, meaning those are 10 to 30% of trips that would have maybe been in a car aren't there. And so I think that's moving forward in a positive way. We also have to consider the social benefits or the physical benefits of yes, some people walk for exercise, but actually it turns out that if you walk beyond exercise, but because it's a pleasant way to be, that's the way those are the places where people are the healthiest. These blue zones that have been studied around the world where people live to be over 100, one of the main reasons is because they are physically active, and physically active, not for exercise, but just from moving around from one place to another place. So, so I just wanted to address the issue of walkability. It's true that these areas are in fact sometimes more dense, but we need that denser housing, for that mix of housing to appeal to a wider range of residents who could potentially live in those areas.
And Marina, I'd say your 10 to 10, did you say 10 to 40 or 10 to 30? 10
to 30. And I know it's
10 to 30. That's, well, that was the older study in Florida. Well, it was mostly in Florida, and that study was not even for higher quality mixed use areas at the time. And the studies have been updated since, and they actually have found higher rates of internal trip capture, 50, 60%. If you add transit, it can get higher than that. So it's been studied quite intensively, and not by us, but by other people. People who we would assume would not be on the side of that finding either. But in addition, it's about having the meaningful destination, and what you don't have in some of the examples that have been built at the job centers. And that is a goal of, say, increasing intensity at the UCF Research Park area. It's a major job center. And if you have a greater mix of uses and housing near there, there's a higher chance that more of those trips will be not by a car. Now, of course, not everybody who works there is going to live nearby, but some percentage will be. And so it's not like an absolute yes or no, it's a sort of percentage of probability. And we're looking to increase the probability of trips that are by means other than a car, but it's not an absolute that every trip would be.
Just to add to that, we think, and I think the examples of the questions were very specific TNDs built within Central Florida. And as we continue to think and reinvent and reimagine Orange County for the next 30 years, I think the approach of Vision 2050 continues to be a little bit more focused on the complete and more incremental organic type of neighborhoods, where there could be specific segments of that neighborhood that could be created, market-based, like the centers and some of these specific place types that continue to reverberate into a desirable destination, where perhaps driving from a specific residential neighborhood into these centers would still be the #1 preferred mode. But the idea continues to be that a lot of these destinations themselves would continue to grow with the mix of uses, as Matt mentioned, that include the open spaces that are planned and planned events. I mean, when you have a specific planned event in an area that has a center and has a discernible center as an open space, if that space continues to be passive, great for the neighbors that can walk towards that space because they can do a picnic. Yes, in Florida with the right shade trees and the right months of the year, you can continue to engage and have an open space experience. The destination and the completeness of that center continues to be critical and very important. When we understand the mix of civic land uses, such as civic centers, libraries, schools, and community centers that are part of the everyday, and even middle schools, as Matt mentioned throughout the presentation, they become nestled into this very, if we design them correctly, and if the policies are strong enough with enough teeth to be able to plan for these places that are for people and at the right scale for individuals, from the younger generations to the older generations to feel comfortable walking towards the destination. Yeah, it may be utopian, but places that are timeless continue to reverberate that element of success that we need to learn how to plan again for those particular places. Great destinations such as Winter Park, for example, other areas outside Central Florida, but close to Central Florida, Winter Haven, and other destinations that could certainly begin to understand how you can take an established general area and reinvent it so that it can provide back that scale of human interaction which we have lost over the years.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to use myself as an example because it's relevant and it's not utopian. When I have to take my daughter to school, who's 10, nearly 10, I'll drive her to school. This week is spring break, so I can walk to work, and it's about 0.8 miles for me to walk from my home to here. And because the environment is conducive to that, I do it. So I'm going to walk home, and I walked here from the office. Someone asked a question about the busy parking lots of Publix and Baldwin Park seem to be at odds from the statistics being presented. And I'm going to say it also depends. If you're going to do your weekly shopping, where some people are going to do their weekly shopping, where they're going to have more than 2 bags, they're going to drive to Publix. But for that, going to buy lunch for the day or going to buy something that you need because you forgot an ingredient, you may choose to walk, which is the way we do it here in this office. And I can't imagine it's any different anywhere else. So keep in mind that if you don't have the infrastructure to encourage people from walking or biking, it won't happen. But if you provide that infrastructure, what we have seen categorically is that people will avail themselves of it at all ages, at all times of the year. So I think on that note, we want to make sure that people, first we want to thank you all for asking some very good and tough questions, and please stay engaged and please keep asking these questions. Our next meeting is going to be on March 31st, and we're going to talk about the Rural East, in particular, the rural development patterns we've seen. We also want to really encourage you to take the survey that's going to be at the end of this session. So we want to wrap this up quickly so that people don't leave. We can put the survey up. But I did want to give, I wanted to thank Alberto, I wanted to thank Matt, I wanted to thank Renzo for his comments, and see if there's any commissioners or anybody else who wants to make final closing comments before we part ways and say thank you and see you on Wednesday. So hearing no final comment, I'm going to say thanks for giving us these 2 hours of your time. Please stay engaged. And please stay on for at least on those in Zoom to take this survey that we're finding to be very helpful. Thank you, and talk to you in 2 days.